Good day. Today is Sunday, 16th March 2025, and again, most of this program is going to be dedicated or at least about the situation in Ukraine and around Ukraine and the diplomacy between the American and Russian superpowers. Now, I say that because this continues to be the main and biggest crisis in international relations, eclipsing all of the others. We see that the two superpowers are trying to take steps to de-escalate the tensions between them and to try to at least bring the conflict in Ukraine under some kind of control, even if they perhaps may not be able to stop it entirely. I will come to that later in this program. But the point is that it is a superpower conflict, and for that reason, it is one that shapes affairs around the world in the most immediate and decisive way. Now, I say that because there's been a flare-up in the Middle East. The United States is now conducting heavy strikes against the Houthi militia in Yemen. By the way, I should say that I understand that they don't like to be called the Houthi militia, but I'm not addressing them specifically. This program obviously is for a wider audience, and if I start using different terms, I'm afraid that people won't quite know what I'm talking about. But anyway, there's been a series of air and missile strikes against the Houthis in Yemen. I expect that on the Duran, Alex Christoforo and I will be discussing those in more detail. Donald Trump has published a post about it on his Truth Social platform. I'm not going to discuss this in today's program, though I don't want to deny its importance. It suggests that the situation in the Middle East continues to be extremely precarious, despite this very uncertain, fragile ceasefire that we have in Gaza, and despite the fact that the Americans and the Russians possibly might start talking eventually about the situation, the conflict between the United States and Iran. So let's now discuss the situation in Ukraine. And I'm going to start again with the military situation, because after the virtual summit meeting in London, about which I'm going to say more, but after that meeting, President Zelensky made a number of claims. He said that Putin is lying about everything. There are no Ukrainian troops encircled in Kursk or in Suja or anywhere like that, that the Ukrainians have the situation fully under control on every battlefront. Putin's claim or that the Russian army is advancing right across the conflict line, that is basically untrue. That was, anyway, my understanding of what Zelensky said. He's got the situation fully under control. The Ukrainians have the situation fully under control, and there is no truth in any of the claims that Putin has made. Interestingly, along with Zelensky saying all of that, he continued to insist that the Russians must accept the proposed ceasefire without any conditions. And he also said that if the Russians do not do so, then the full might of the collective West and of the United States must be deployed against them. Though, again, it's completely unclear what he imagines how he imagines that should be done. But anyway, let's look at the military situation and try to work out whether what Zelensky is telling us is the truth. Well, I'm going to start by saying that early this morning, the Ukrainian General Staff published an updated map of the military situation, and it shows that the combat line has moved away from the city of the town of Suja in Kursk region. So this appears to be a admission, a very, very quiet admission by the Ukrainian military that the Russians have indeed captured Suja. There's been no public announcement. The Ukrainians hardly ever confirm Russian gains. I ought to say that, it's quite often the case that the Russians themselves withhold information about Ukrainian gains, Ukrainian counterattacks, and that sort of thing. But they never do it on the level that the Ukrainians do. It took, as I remember, the better part of a year before the Ukrainians finally admitted that Bakhmut, the town of Bakhmut, which the Russians captured in May 2023, had been lost. And even then, there's been, as far as I know, no full statement or public announcement or anything like that. So the Ukrainians generally don't like to admit that they've been pushed back or that they've lost ground. But the Ukrainian General Staff, through the way it's published its map, appears to confirm that the Russians are indeed in control of Suja. Of course, in reality, there is absolutely no doubt about this. We've had lots of pictures and films of Russian soldiers in Suja, including close, well, not just close, around the famous department store in the center of Suja, which became such a topic of discussion both in the Ukrainian and Russian medias for a time. But anyway, there's no doubt at all that the Russians are in Suja. One sees lots of film and pictures of the Russians there. And the thing that strikes me about all of these pictures and films is that the soldiers are moving around Suja without any apparent fear of fighting. I mean, they don't seem to be concerned that the Ukrainians might attack them. So there's never been, over the last 2 or 3 days, any serious doubt, at least not in my mind, that Suja has indeed been recaptured by the Russians and that Suja is indeed fully under Russian control. And there was some lingering doubt, at least in my mind, whether some of the outlying parts of Suja, the west of Suja, there might still be some Ukrainian soldiers there. But as I discussed in my program yesterday, that is obviously no longer the case. So Zelensky, so far as I know, didn't talk about Suja itself. He did imply that the Ukrainians, however, still have a foothold in Kursk. He didn't admit to the single most important fact, however, that Suja itself, the only settlement of any significance that the Ukrainians were able to capture in Suja, that is now once again under Russian control. Now, what about the rest of the situation? And I say that because, of course, Putin, over the course of his press conference on Wednesday, said that a group of Ukrainian troops in Kursk region has been encircled by the Russians. Trump took that up and asked Putin to allow these people to live. Putin then responded at a Security Council meeting in Moscow, a Russian Security Council meeting in Moscow. He said that he would give the troops in Kursk, the Ukrainian troops in Kursk, an opportunity to lay down their arms. That this would require a decision by Zelensky himself, obviously. Subsequently, we've had confirmation that the Russians are giving the Ukrainians in this area where this encirclement has taken place until 6 a.m. on Monday, 6 a.m. local time, on Monday to lay down their arms. So is there any truth to this? Well, I think the first place to go is to what Group of Forces North are telling us about the situation. Group of Forces North is the Russian military grouping that is conducting operations in Kursk region, and they are the people who have defeated the Ukrainians there, who've just recaptured Suja, and this is what they say. This is their very last report, and they say this. On March 15th, Group of Forces North continued to carry out tasks to liberate the Kursk region. We continue to grind down the Ukrainian armed forces units, advancing on all sections of the front. The enemy is putting up fierce resistance, clinging to every meter of Russian land. After we liberated the village of Rubanshina, which happened yesterday, fierce fighting began for the neighboring village of Gogolevka, which is located 3 kilometers from the border crossing. Now, there's a certain view that the capture of Rubanshina effectively closes the trap around the Ukrainian troops in Kursk. If the Russians do capture the village of Gogolevka, then presumably that trap will be closed even further. And then Group of Forces North goes on to say this. Fierce fighting also continues in the forests around Guevo and west of Kurilovka. We are confronted by both the Ukrainian armed forces who remain in their positions and the enemy's hastily transferred reserves who are unaware of the situation at the front. Contrary to popular belief, the Ukrainian Armed Forces Command, that's to say Zelensky and Syrskyi, continue to increase the number of their forces in the area. Over the past 24 hours alone, the enemy attempted to transfer airborne assault units of the 47th Mechanized Brigade, and hastily staffed assault groups of the 225th Special Regiment, the so-called Death Regiment, to the Suja border area. The enemy's actions were promptly detected by our intelligence, and the reserves that arrived were destroyed. The Kiev regime apparently still believes that it can bargain for some preferences in potential peace talks if it holds on to some territory of the old Russian regions. However, our military political leadership has repeatedly stated that this is not subject to discussion, and all enemy forces who refuse to lay down their arms will be destroyed. The total advance of our troops in Kursk region was 4.7 kilometers, and 15 units of enemy armored vehicles were destroyed. And Group of Forces North then gives an extraordinary list of armored vehicles who have been destroyed. And it goes on, and it includes a tank, 2 armored personnel carriers, 3 infantry fighting vehicles, including a Marder vehicle from Germany, 7 armored fighting vehicles, 6 field artillery guns, including a Bogdana self-propelled gun, that's a Ukrainian-developed gun, and a PZH-2000 supplied by Germany, and lots of other destruction of that kind. And anyway, that, to my mind, doesn't exactly confirm an encirclement, but comes very close to doing so. What Group of Forces North is saying is that the Ukrainian forces are being ground down, but that instead of conducting any kind of organized retreat, the Ukrainian leadership, Zelensky and Syrskyi, remain committed to trying to maintain some kind of foothold in Kursk region, and that they are continuing to pour troops into the bag, so that the bag is actually growing. The number of Ukrainian troops inside that bag is actually growing. And remarkably, they're still sending paratroop units into the battle, and they've now started to send elements of the 47th Mechanized Brigade. Now, the 47th Mechanized Brigade is Ukraine's fire brigade. It's the unit that was trained way back in 2022, 2023. It was the unit that was originally equipped with the Leopard 2 tanks and with the Bradley tanks, and which carried out the first assault on Rabotino during Ukraine's summer 2023 offensive. It's widely considered by many people to be one of the best military units in the Ukrainian army. It's had multiple changes of command. It's lost many of its original men who originally were serving in it. I remember that for a time, it was the unit that tried to repel Russian advances as the Russians advanced west of Avdiivka. After the fall of Avdiivka, it was transferred back to trying to resist the Russian advance there. It was again very, very badly mauled during the fighting. It was during that fighting, it was supplied by the United States with 31 Abrams tanks. Apparently around 19 or 20 of those have now been destroyed in fighting in various places, destroyed or captured by the Russians. It's a brigade which Ukraine continues to use or overuse in order to try to plug gaps in its lines. It has previously been deployed to Kursk region at a time when the Ukrainians were still trying to advance there. This was months ago. It was then transferred from Kursk region some months ago, apparently, it was some weeks ago, just ahead of the Russian offensive. I am not sure quite where it went to, but a reasonable guess is that it might have been redeployed to Pokrovsk, where the Ukrainians have conducted a series of, I should say, unsuccessful counterattacks, though there is no word that the 47th Mechanized Brigade was directly involved in those counterattacks. But wherever it was that it was sent to, it has now been thrown back into the fighting in Kursk region and in Sumy region in order to try to plug the holes that are developing there. And fascinatingly, not to try to help the Ukrainians who are encircled or almost encircled in Kursk region to retreat, but on the contrary, to try to hold the positions there, to try to hold on to a few tiny border villages, Gogolevka and places like that, right on the border, despite the fact that the town of Sumy itself has been recaptured by the Russians. To me, if that is true, and I would say again that we only have it from Group of Forces North, if that is true, then that is a classic example of reinforcing failure. And I would say straight away that it brings us back to Zelensky's words. He insists that the situation is under control, that the Ukrainians are holding their positions. He won't admit that Suja itself has already fallen to the Russians, so that the battle for Suja, the most important place in Kursk region, is already over. And despite the fact that there is irrefutable evidence of this, and despite the fact that the Ukrainian General Staff have now quietly acknowledged this, but he won't accept the military realities. This is again according to Group of Forces North. He's continuing to put pressure on his military chiefs, on Syrsky, and the result is that more men are being sent into the cauldron, into the fire, and more Ukrainian forces are being destroyed at an ever faster rate. So this is what we are hearing from Group of Forces North. Now, Group of Forces North has generally been a very reliable source about the fighting in Kursk region and in Volchansk and those sort of other places. Usually they do, by the way, acknowledge retreats from particular locations when the need arises to do so. They also have a website which, as I've discussed, has personality, that gives very vivid and interesting accounts of the fighting and of the perspective of the fighting of the Russian soldiers. Which, as I said, it departs from the very bland language that you tend to find in other Russian military bulletins, including those published by the Ministry of Defense itself. But as I said, overall, I have found them a reliable source, and I assume that they are telling the truth. And bear in mind that no less a person than the Chief of the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces, General Gerasimov, recently went to Kursk region, and the overall Commander-in-Chief of the Russian Armed Forces, Putin himself, was recently there. I find it very difficult to believe that Group of Forces North, its commanders, would lie about the situation directly to Putin and Gerasimov when they were actually physically present. And of course, Putin and Gerasimov wouldn't have just spoken to the overall commanders. They clearly spoke to lower level commanders as well. I cannot believe that Putin himself is being deceived about the situation in Kursk region. So, encircled, apparently it is extremely difficult for the Ukrainian forces in Kursk region to retreat. There is no dispute from anybody that the Russians have drone control and air control, and that their aircraft are also very active in this area, and they've been dropping their terrifying fab bombs, of which, by the way, production supposedly is increasing. So it is indeed very difficult to retreat. The access points are in effect closed, but instead of retreating, the Ukrainians appear to be trying to reinforce. Ukrainian forces, including units of the 47th Mechanized Brigade, are being sent to reinforce the Ukrainian troops in this exact area, presumably being sent along the same roads over which the Russians have fire control, and Group of Forces North tells us that they're being destroyed in the process. So that, it seems to me, is the situation in Kursk region. It's not Putin who's lying. He may have overstated things to some extent, but it's not Putin who is lying. It is Zelensky who is. He is making things, he's spinning, as he so often does, to make things look better than they really are. Now, we've had more examples of this over the last 24 hours. Now, about 2 days ago, the Ukrainians claimed that they'd mounted some kind of successful counterattack in the Kupiansk area. That may or may not have been true. But DS, the famous Ukrainian mapping project, has suddenly published an update on its map, and it suddenly shows an enormous increase in the territory that the Russians control west of the Oskol River, that the bridgehead along the Oskol River has suddenly increased significantly in size. In fact, it's a whole belt of territory north of the Oskol River, which we'd had no report previously that the Russians had even attacked, and suddenly DS is showing it as being under Russian control. So the situation there has deteriorated, and I should say that it has clearly deteriorated over a certain period of time. It has not happened over the last 24 hours. We are talking about what looks like the Russians crossing the Oskol River in multiple places, and it's most unlikely that this was done over just 24 hours. Probably we are looking at the results of weeks of fighting, and suddenly the Ukrainians are acknowledging that this is in fact the case. I say that because after a certain episode that took place some weeks ago, when DS was suddenly taken off, closed down for about 24 hours, well, it came back, but it has never been quite as reliable as it was previously. And I strongly suspect that the Ukrainian General Staff, the Ukrainian military, are now keeping very careful tabs over the information it is reporting. And though DS still tends to be a bit more up to date than other Ukrainian reporting channels are, they're not as up to date or as reliable as they were. So it looks as if there's been a significant loss of positions by the Ukrainians in the area of the Oskol River, north of Kupiansk, and it's one that the Ukrainians failed to acknowledge. Instead, they gave us this talk about 2 days ago of a successful counterattack in this area, and we see now that there's good reason to doubt that that was the case. Well, we now also have a lot more information from Toretsk. Again, there were lots of reports over the last 2 weeks or so that the Ukrainians had mounted a series of successful counterattacks in the Toretsk area, and that they'd recaptured a significant part of northern Toretsk. Now, this all began with an article that appeared in the Daily Telegraph, which appeared to, which didn't imply, it said that fighting in Toretsk was still underway. This is at a time when virtually all of the reporting channels, in fact, as far as I know, all of the main reporting channels were acknowledging that Toretsk was indeed under full Russian control. But anyway, this article in the Daily Telegraph claimed, on the basis of meetings that Daily Telegraph journalists had with Ukrainian military officials, that fighting in Toretsk was still taking place. And it seemed to me at the time that it was largely a work of fiction. But what then happened is that the Ukrainians appear to have made some attempt to make that fiction real. And they did carry out a series of attacks, apparently, in the Toretsk area. I said that these looked to me to be mostly raids in order to preserve the narrative, to maintain the narrative that an attack on Toretsk was underway and that there was still fighting going on there. But over the last 2 days, it looks as if the Russians have largely cleared Toretsk of whatever Ukrainian soldiers were inserted into Toretsk as a result of these counterattacks. Indeed, there's even suggestions that one group of Ukrainian troops in northeastern Toretsk might, as a result of these attacks, have now become surrounded by the Russians, though it's more likely, I think, that they will withdraw before the trap on them closes. But again, what we see is the result basically of a PR exercise, an unwillingness by the Ukrainians to acknowledge that Toretsk had fallen. There's been the narrative that the Ukrainians have been actively trying to sell to their Western friends, and indeed to the Ukrainian people as well, that there's been basically a slowdown or standstill in the Russian advance since February. And there was the embarrassing fact that Toretsk fell after this standstill, supposed standstill or slowdown in the Russian advance. So it became important to try to dispute the Russian claim that Toretsk was indeed under Russian control. So as I said, we saw these counterattacks, coming after the story was published in the Daily Telegraph, and we see the result. The attempt to keep the narrative alive of a continuing battle in Toretsk is simply resulting in the deaths of more Ukrainian soldiers at a time when Ukraine is already short of material and of men. And I think the same is true in the Pokrovsk area. The Ukrainians also conducted various attacks around Pokrovsk. They made attempts to recapture the village of Pishanye and then the village of Shevchenko. They made multiple claims that they'd recaptured the village of Kotlino. My understanding is that all of these attacks, all of these counterattacks have failed. Film appeared, I think, the day before yesterday, showing the Russians in at least a part of Shevchenko, which the Ukrainians claimed to have recaptured. It looks as if all of these attacks, to the extent that they took place, were failures as well. In fact, we've had throughout this year, from the start of this year, a whole series of Ukrainian attacks. There were 2 attempted offensives by the Ukrainians in Kursk region itself. They made an attempt to break through to the village of Berdin. It was a complete failure. It didn't achieve anything. We've had Ukrainian counterattacks or attempted counterattacks in Toretsk, which were failures as well. We've had the attacks around Pokrovsk. All of this is a direct product of the style of war that even more now than previously, Zelensky and his officials have been fighting. Obviously, much of what the Ukrainians do on the battlefronts is dictated by battlefield needs. Some Ukrainian commanders undoubtedly know their job and put up resistance, effective resistance, in all sorts of places. But for Zelensky himself, it is the imagery that is most important. The imagery of the Ukrainians either advancing in Kursk or of holding their positions there, wrong-footing the Russians. It is the imagery of the battle in Toretsk still being underway. It is the imagery of Ukraine still successfully defending against the Russians and of the Russians being brought to a stop. And that is what he is still persisting in. He comes, he talks to the British, he talks to others, he makes all sorts of extravagant claims, and his officials make all sorts of extravagant claims about Russian losses. They claim that the Russians have lost 1 million men. That is actually in the British media today. The Daily Telegraph has just reported the claim, being careful for once to say that it actually does come from Ukraine. The British Defence Ministry, by the way, has simply been reduced to republishing Ukrainian claims of Russian losses. And these Ukrainian claims are not only being accepted by the British Defence Ministry, historically they've been largely or mostly accepted by the Americans as well, and they're also accepted by places, by websites like the Institute of the Study of War, which is the go-to source that the Western media uses for understanding the state of the conflict in Ukraine. So all of these stories, which is what they basically are circulated by the Ukrainians. giving, I think, many people in the West who insist on taking their ideas purely from what the Ukrainians are saying and discounting what the Russians are saying, giving them a profoundly wrong understanding of the state of the battle. Now, I don't know what's going to happen over the next, well, it's less than 24 hours now. Putin's time limit deadline for the Ukrainian troops in Kursk region runs out at 6 a.m. I presume that's local time, maybe Moscow time, tomorrow morning. There are some claims that the Russians have redeployed troops from the Kursk area to Pokrovsk. I don't think that's likely to be the case myself. I think, on the contrary, I suspect that the Russians are more likely to be reinforcing success at the moment. And I suspect that after the 6 o'clock, the 6 a.m. deadline, we're going to see an intensification of the Russian attacks on the Ukrainian troops in Kursk region. Those troops do appear to be in a trap, but it is a trap that has been sprung on them mostly by their own high command. They could have been ordered to retreat from Suja and Kursk region months ago, or weeks ago, or even days ago. Instead, they're being ordered to stand fast, even whilst the Russians are closing the roads and are maneuvering to encircle and destroy them. It is completely irrational approach to command, and as I said, it is based upon narrative creation more than anything else. Well, that is my analysis of the situation on the battlefronts. I should say that the drone attacks that Ukraine is launching against Russia are much the same as well. Again, one reads lots of reports in the West about the effect these drone attacks are having on Russia. One sees fewer claims any longer about these drone attacks having an effect on Russian civilians, weakening Russian willpower in the conflict. I remember when Ukraine conducted its first drone attacks on Moscow. I think it was back in 2023. There were all sorts of claims about how this had shaken Russia and shaken morale in Russia. That wasn't true then, and the more extensive drone attacks are not having that kind of effect now. If you go to Sonar 21, Larry Johnson's superb blog, Larry Johnson, former CIA and State Department official, and I should say I consider him a personal friend as well. Anyway, Larry Johnson was actually in Moscow during the last big drone attack by the Ukrainians. In fact, the very big one, the one where 97 drones were shot down by the Russian air defenses over Moscow. Anyway, Larry Johnson, I presume, was in a hotel in the middle of Moscow, and he says on his blog, Sonar 21, that he wasn't even aware at any time during the night that a drone attack was taking place. He slept through it undisturbed. There was no air raid warnings or sirens, no explosions, nothing of that kind. There was no hint or trouble or sense of trouble at any point. So, drone attacks that have mainly a performative basis as well. Sometimes drones do get through and do cause damage to individual refineries. It is certainly the case, as I've said already, that the Russians have had to divert air defense resources to try to protect refineries and civilian facilities and things of that kind. And that has to some extent maybe reduced the capabilities of the Russians on the battlefronts. But these drone attacks are not just pinpricks. They are if anything, even less than that. To repeat again, a point I have made many times, there is no discernible effect on the performance of these Ukrainian drone attacks on the performance of the Russian economy. There is no discernible effect whatsoever. And that tells us that the claims that are made about these drone attacks by the Ukrainians and by the media are massively inflated and exaggerated. So anyway, that's where we are. A war which Zelensky himself continues to see basically as an exercise in media management. Not all of his commanders agree with this approach, that is clear, but which nonetheless is distorting the entire way in which Ukraine is conducting its war. And it still amazes me that 3 years after the start of the war, there's so many people in the West who continue to fall for it. So, overall, coming back to what I was saying at the start of the program, it is clear to me that Putin and his people are telling things much closer to the truth. Maybe they're not telling us the exact truth, but much closer to the truth than the Ukrainians are. They're giving us a much more accurate picture of the state of the fighting than the Ukrainians are doing, or by the way have ever done. Now, let's now turn to the diplomacy. Now, there's been a number of relatively, minor matters to clear up first. Firstly, Sky News, basically a British media operation, though one owned by Rupert Murdoch, ultimately, largely owned and controlled by Rupert Murdoch, published a story that Putin on Wednesday kept Steve Witkoff, Trump's envoy, waiting for 8.5 hours before he met with him, and that this was a demonstration of power, that it was intended presumably to put Witkoff in his place, and Sky News presented it as part of the game of psychological war that the Russians are allegedly waging. This is an utter and absurd fantasy. On the day when Putin eventually met Witkoff, the Russians, Putin to be precise, had a whole series of meetings with all sorts of other people. Firstly, he spoke and met with President Lukashenko of Belarus. That is a meeting that would have taken a significant amount of time. He then conducted a joint press conference with President Lukashenko. This is the press conference in which he ticked off the various concerns he had about the proposed ceasefire that the Americans and the Ukrainians had agreed to in Jeddah. He also had to find the time to speak to Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, and that would have been an important call. The Kremlin tells us that this call took place at 10 to midnight Moscow time. So he would have gone straight out, in effect, from the press conference, probably had further meetings with Lukashenko, and then he would have called MBS or spoken with MBS. I think when you look at the Russian readout, it's fairly clear that it was Putin who initiated the call. And somewhere, at some point over these hours, perhaps during the time between the press conference with Lukashenko and the call to MBS, perhaps during that period, Putin will also have had to meet with Witkov. So we are talking, when we're talking about Putin, we are talking about an extremely busy man. The fact that he decided to meet with Witkov on the 13th of March at all shows that he was giving up time from what would have been for him an already intense day to meet with Witkov. And that tells us that far from engaging in some kind of power play or anything of that kind, Putin, in fact, made a decision to meet with Witkov as soon as he reasonably could. Bear in mind that before meeting with Witkov, he would have needed to be briefed about some of the things that Witkov had come to discuss. It's clear that Witkov wasn't just waiting and hanging around to meet Putin. He was also speaking with other Russian officials as well. Those Russian officials would have needed to brief Putin about their discussions with Witkov. So Putin, who by this point in the day must already have been feeling fairly tired, would have needed to assimilate all of that information before he met Witkov and had a discussion with him. And we don't know, by the way, how long that discussion with Witkov lasted, but my guess is that it probably lasted at least 30 minutes, perhaps as much as an hour, given the importance of the topics that needed to be discussed. Now, Trump himself has reacted very badly to this Sky News report, which he sees, obviously, as a telltale sign that the media are trying to create trouble. I will read Trump's Truth Social post briefly. The fake news, as usual, is at it again. Why can't they be honest just for once? Last night, I read that President Putin kept my highly respected ambassador and special envoy, Steve Witkov, waiting for over 9 hours, when in fact there was no wait whatsoever. Other meetings with other representatives of Russia did take place. Obviously, my guess is that Witkov will have met with Ushakov and perhaps with Lavrov. Just to say, Ushakov has spoken about his contacts with his opposite number. I'd assumed that was Mike Waltz in my previous program. It seems, in fact, that Ushakov was actually referring to Witkov. So almost certainly Ushakov and Witkov had a conversation as well. So other meetings with other representatives of Russia did take place, and obviously they took some time, but they were very productive. From there, things went quickly and efficiently, and all signs seemed to be, hopefully, very good. In conclusion, there was no 9-hour wait or any wait at all. The only reason they made up that story is to try and demean, because, and then we have the usual tirade from Trump about fake media and all of that, which I'm not going to read. You can find it all on Truth Social for yourself and read it there. So Witkov had, according to Trump, a very successful meeting, almost certainly with Ushakov, and as we know, with Putin himself. Probably a fairly detailed and lengthy discussion. Now, Trump has done something else. He's not just responded to this message about this story about Witkov. He's also demoted Kellogg, and there's been rumours about Kellogg's position for some time, but we now have confirmation of this, and it comes from Trump himself. I am pleased to inform you that General Keith Kellogg has been appointed Special Envoy to Ukraine. General Kellogg, a highly respected military expert will deal with President Zelensky and the Ukrainian leadership. He knows them well and they have a very good working relationship together. Congratulations to General Kellogg. It's typical Trump. He makes a demotion look like a promotion. Previously, Kellogg was supposed to be Trump's envoy, a peace envoy, to cover every aspect of the conflict. I was commenting on the fact weeks ago that he seemed to be speaking exclusively to the Europeans and to the Ukrainians, but not to the Russians. I found that very strange myself. Apparently there have been murmurs and complaints about him for some time. He was then, this is within the United States, he was then kept away from the meeting in Riyadh, which Witkoff attended, along with Rubio and Waltz, but Kellogg wasn't there. Kellogg himself then explained it. He said that there was a division of labor. He would be talking to the Europeans and to the Ukrainians, and it would be the job of others, presumably Witkoff, to work on the Russians. So, from being the peace envoy, he is now basically Trump's contact messenger to Zelensky. Well, there might be actually some reason for this. About a week ago, I read an account, I can't remember in which publication, about the state of the US Embassy in Kiev. It said that the current US ambassador, who was appointed to Ukraine, presumably by the Biden administration, is a close personal friend and long-standing ally of Victoria Nuland, and had in fact worked with her on many occasions in the State Department, and that she is a person who has a similar outlook to Ukraine and to the entire conflict there as Victoria Nuland does herself. And though the article didn't say this, I'm going to make a shrewd guess that the perspectives of this particular ambassador is identical to the perspectives of the entire staff of the embassy. In other words, the entire staff of the embassy, the American embassy in Kiev, is made up of committed neocons who are close allies of Nuland and who share her perspectives on Russia and on the conflict. Now, of course, Trump has the authority to simply sack the ambassador and everyone else in the embassy if he chooses. But there might be reasons why he would not want to do that. Because if he sacks the ambassador, he then has to appoint a replacement, or at least someone to take over the ambassador's role. It would look extremely strange if there was no US ambassador in Kiev at this time. And it would certainly provoke comment, and I suspect quite a lot of criticism as well, especially at a time when the United States is working to re-establish full diplomatic contacts with the Russians, and when there's been an agreement on who the Russian ambassador to the United States should be, and apparently there's also underway discussion as to who the American ambassador in Moscow should be. So, sorting out diplomatic representation in Moscow and Washington whilst sacking the ambassador in Kiev might invite comments about this was further proof of Trump's bias in favor of the Russians. There's already enough of that. And perhaps Trump doesn't want to make his problems worse. So he probably would feel that he does need an ambassador in Kiev, or at least a representative in Kiev. But sacking the ambassador, but it might not be wise. And of course, if he's going to have an ambassador in Kiev, he or she needs to gain confirmation from the Senate, where of course Ukraine still has friends. And probably Trump doesn't want to have yet another challenging confirmation battle in the Senate over the next couple of weeks. So one elegant way to short-circuit this whole process is to basically cut out the embassy altogether and appoint his own emissary, and that is Kellogg, who does know Trump very well and who is personally loyal to Trump, even if he is seen as somewhat sympathetic to the Ukrainians. And there's not going to be really much objection to Kellogg. So make Kellogg the representative, have him deal with Zelensky on a regular basis, where maybe you can't cut out the embassy entirely. No doubt the ambassador will be turning up at meetings together with Kellogg. But at least you have your own person able to go to Kiev, able to meet with the Ukrainians, able to brief Trump. A person, Kellogg, who Trump knows and likes and has worked with before, and who can be relied upon to do the job with loyalty to Trump, rather than to Victoria Nuland and to the neocon crowd in Washington. So this appointment of Kellogg makes a certain sense, but it is nonetheless a demotion. As I said, it removes Kellogg from pole position. And it's now quite clear to me that the person who is going to lead the negotiations from this point forward from the American side is Witkoff. Going back to the other Truth Social post, Trump refers to Witkoff as highly respected ambassador and special envoy Steve Witkoff. So it looks as if Witkoff is now Trump's point man in dealings with the Russians. He will be heading the negotiations with the Russians. And his counterpart and the person who will be leading the negotiations on the Russian side and will have regular meetings with Witkoff will be Ushakov. Now, here I will express some thoughts of my own. Everything about Witkoff suggests to me that he's a tough and gritty figure. I don't think he's somebody who has any lack of ability or intelligence. He is very inexperienced in conducting diplomatic contacts at this level. I mean, his experience goes back no earlier than January 20th, when Trump was inaugurated and sent him off to broker the ceasefire in Gaza, in which, by the way, he was, it must be said, very successful. So we're talking about somebody who comes across to me as an extremely talented and tough amateur, and I mean absolutely no disrespect if I say that. Maybe it's better to reach out for someone who is not part of the Washington foreign policy establishment. None of the people in the State Department strike me as being up for this sort of thing at all. Certainly they're not the sort of people who look to me like they have the ability to move forward and come up with new ideas to break the logjam in negotiations, as Witkoff does. But to repeat again, I've spoken about how the Russians have massive experience in this kind of diplomatic contacts, that they have huge expertise and professional knowledge. And I think that if Witkoff is going to take on Lavrov and Putin, and by the way, Ushakov as well, it might be a good idea, and I just repeat this once more, if he does reach out to some professional expertise. He could talk to Chas Freeman, Ambassador Chas Freeman, who's negotiated with the Russians many times and has that level of knowledge, and who's very active and who I think would give a great deal of good advice. Another possibility mentioned by another personal friend of mine, Edward Roos, Naftali Bennett, the former Prime Minister of Israel, a controversial figure, not always liked by many people. I'm not sure I like him, but he has negotiated with the Russians in the past. He is, by all accounts, an experienced negotiator. He came very close to brokering the peace agreement in the Istanbul Agreement in April 2022. He's someone that the Russians know and get on with. He might be another option. And I would just suggest that Witkoff perhaps seek advice from some of these people. Now, here we come back to things that Witkoff has himself said, because Witkoff has previously in discussions said that Istanbul does need to provide the framework for the negotiations going forward. And that is a major step forward by the Americans. They appear to understand now that the Russians, if they're going to be persuaded to end this war at all, and I want to repeat again at this point that the Russians so far have not agreed to a ceasefire. They may do so, but they've set down stringent conditions. And as I've already discussed, when an offer is sent back with requests for modified terms, additional terms, that is in effect a rejection, not an acceptance. Anyway, the Russians have not so far accepted a ceasefire. But if this process is to be taken forward, if there is going to be a cessation of hostilities, which is probably closer to what the Russians are looking at, then they need to be satisfied that this is indeed going to lead to some sort of outcome soon, not in 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 years' time, but some kind of outcome now, probably within the next few weeks or months. And the framework is Istanbul, or as I've put it, Istanbul plus. Istanbul with various additions, as discussed by Putin in his speech to the Foreign Ministry, the one that he made in June last year. And Witkoff does seem to understand that. He's talked about that in his public comments. So, to move forward, the Russians are talking about Istanbul. Witkoff seems to be open to this. Witkoff and Ushakov have clearly formed a successful relationship. And we see that Putin himself is taking a positive view so far of developments. Now, going back to that Security Council meeting that took place 2 days ago, the one in which Putin gave the Ukrainian soldiers in Kursk, told the Ukrainian soldiers in Kursk that they needed to lay down their arms if they wanted to survive. Putin did say a few things at the start of his comments about the current state of relations between Russia and the United States and about the steps being taken by the Trump administration to try to improve relations between the US and Russia. And what Putin said was this: we know that the new administration led by President Trump is doing everything to restore at least something of what was practically reduced to nothing, destroyed by the previous administration. The process is not easy, if not to say very complicated. Nevertheless, as everyone is well aware, I had a telephone conversation with President Trump. Our foreign minister had the first contacts with his American counterpart, and Yuri Ushakov, aide to the president of Russia, met with his vis-a-vis. That is to say, obviously, Witkoff. So, on the whole, the situation is starting to move. Let's see how this will work out. This is our topic for today. So, Putin acknowledges that the Trump administration, that its ultimate objective is to try to improve relations with Russia. In fact, Trump is saying so. The key thing to understand is that it is this attempt to improve relations with Russia, even more than the state of the conflict in Ukraine, which is creating so much fear and alarm amongst Washington's European allies. And we saw a further manifestation of this yesterday in Starmer's very strange summit, the virtual summit, the coalition of the willing that I touched on yesterday. Now, just to say, it's perhaps a good idea to get, first of all, a sense of how completely weird that summit truly was. It was conducted on a virtual basis. Apparently, some people did turn up. I gather Macron was physically present, and Zelensky appears to have been. But most of the leaders who the British government spoke with, who were called to the meeting by Starmer, were contacted over the telephone. So it was mostly a meeting conducted over the telephone or through Zoom calls or whatever. Now that, of course, means that we don't have a joint press conference. The only press conference given, basically, is by Starmer himself. And he appeared at a lectern surrounded by British flags and all of that, very much the leader in command of his coalition of the willing. As I've said already, I think that is a remarkably ill-chosen term, given that it was first developed to describe the coalition that invaded Iraq in 2003, with the consequences that we all know. Anyway, Starmer called this meeting, but there was no joint news conference. Most of the leaders were not there. They were contacted through, as I say, electronically. They participated electronically. Now, we were told that 25 or perhaps 27 nations participated. Now, this is a very strange thing. I've not been able to find a single article in the British media that lists the countries that actually participated in this meeting. I suspect if you look around, spend your time searching around the various British government websites, you will no doubt find a list of those countries. We know a few that participated: Germany, France, Turkey participated, but we don't, at least I haven't yet seen a full list of these countries. And again, I wonder why. Was it because there was a certain unwillingness to disclose to the British public how militarily unimportant some of these countries are. Just saying. The impression given is that this was a leaders' summit. Some leaders did participate. But an awful lot apparently didn't. Apparently, the contacts were conducted at lower levels than the leader himself. So I said Turkey participated, but it seems that Erdogan didn't actually join the summit. One of his officials did, perhaps Foreign Minister Fidan. Who knows? So there is, by the way, a question as to whether Meloni participated or whether Italy participated at all. Anyway, anybody who wants to go and plough through the labyrinth of British government websites can no doubt find that list. I would be curious to find it and to know exactly who did actually turn up and who in fact did participate. There were reports, media reports before the meeting, that Meloni was not keen to participate personally, that she is opposed to the deployment of European peacekeepers to Ukraine under any circumstances, and that Italy itself will not participate. And there was apparently even a question about whether Italy would be involved in this summit meeting at all. Anyway, that's another aspect of this meeting. But Starmer, nonetheless, came along and addressed the British people, as I said, at this lectern with the Union Jacks and all of that. And he made all sorts of very extraordinary claims. He said that the questions are now moving to an operational phase. There's apparently to be a Chiefs of Staff meeting on Thursday. This is all revolving around the deployment of European peacekeepers to enforce a peace in Ukraine. He was asked directly whether an American backstop, in other words, a guarantee to these European peacekeepers, was needed. And he said yes. And he was asked whether it had been obtained. And he said, well, words to the effect that that is still a work in progress, which suggests, in fact, that the answer is no. So no backstop or security guarantee obtained from the United States. And as we saw from the events of 2 weeks ago, Donald Trump has basically ruled that whole idea out. And for the moment, there's no sign that he's prepared to change his views about it. So anyway, nonetheless, according to Starmer, the planning for all of this is still taking place, is nonetheless going to take place. Now, the Daily Telegraph, interestingly, then went out of its way in an article to contradict him. It said that it had spoken to various British officials, and the officials said that there had been actually no agreement amongst the participants at this meeting to send peacekeepers to Ukraine. There'd be no decision in principle taken about this. There'd be no agreement that this was something that should even happen. And yet, here we see Starmer going on and talking about moving troops to Ukraine as part of some, and that the planning is being taken further in order to do this, with the Chiefs of Staff meeting on Thursday. And then we had even more provocative statements by Emmanuel Macron. Macron was asked about the fact that the Russians have vigorously objected to this idea. They've gone out of their way to say that this is completely unacceptable. And then Macron said that he didn't see why the Russians should have any say in the matter. If there was a ceasefire, this would be something that Zelensky could ask for as the leader of a sovereign state, and the Europeans could deploy their troops on that basis, even if the Russians said no. And a few hours later, a British cabinet minister, West Streeting, who is, by the way, being positioned by some people in Britain to take over from Starmer as part of the Labour Party's internal battles, about which I'm not going to waste any time on this programme. Anyway, he said that if British and French peacekeepers and European peacekeepers were deployed to Ukraine and the Russians did attack them, then it would be a massive escalation by the Russians. The deployment of the peacekeepers is not an escalation, even if the Russians object to it. An attack by the Russians on those peacekeepers, something which the Russians have made clear they would do, that supposedly is the escalation. Now, as I pointed out a couple of days ago, on the very same day, on Wednesday, when Putin was speaking and in effect commenting and discussing the American-Ukrainian ceasefire proposal, on that very same day, Lavrov himself made an important comment. And that comment has attracted remarkably little attention, but it was basically a warning to the Trump White House to be extremely careful about the Europeans. The Europeans are clearly out to make trouble and cannot be trusted. And we see, just to remind ourselves as to what exactly it was that Lavrov said. Lavrov said words to the effect that if the Europeans were thinking of using the Ukrainians to deceive the Americans, as they had previously deceived the Russians, the Americans would not fall for it. If the Europeans now want to make the Ukrainians outwit the Russians as well, I think that the Trump administration is fully aware of their intentions and will see through them. Now, the point is that all of this talk about deploying peacekeepers, European peacekeepers to Ukraine, is designed to do either one of two things. Either it is designed to wreck the entire negotiation process. Have the Russians say this is, the Russians have already said that it is completely unacceptable. Trick, however, Trump into backing this idea and to provide security guarantees, in which case the Russians will come back and will say that this whole thing cannot work. The presence of European peacekeepers is completely unacceptable and that they've made that clear many times and that they're not going to reverse their position on this. That could be one objective that the Europeans are going to achieve. Or if there is a ceasefire, Zelensky ignores whatever the terms of the ceasefire are, asks the Europeans to deploy their peacekeepers. That puts the Russians in the position of having to decide whether or not to attack them. And if the Russians do attack the peacekeepers, as night follows day, the Europeans will run to the Americans and say, look, you see, the Russians can't be trusted. They've gone back on the ceasefire. You must come to protect our troops in Ukraine, and at the very least, this whole process of rapprochement between you and the Russians cannot continue. So this is the trap that is being laid. At some levels, this meeting that Starmer called, as I said, is surreal. There's no published list, none that I know of the countries that participated. No confirmation of which leaders attended or not. It looks as if no actual, real decisions were made there. But Starmer and Macron are still pushing forward with this idea. They're trying to get their troops into Ukraine, either in order to wreck the rapprochement between the Americans and the Russians, or if they can't achieve that, well, to sabotage that rapprochement by setting up conditions for an armed clash. Now, this is incredibly dangerous, indeed phenomenally reckless behavior, but it brings us back to the point I made just now, which is that for the Europeans, the ultimate nightmare is one in which the Americans and the Russians come to terms. They don't just sort out between them the conflict with Ukraine. They establish, well, at least civilized relations with each other, and they stabilize the situation in Europe to each of their satisfaction in a way that basically imposes a new security system on Europe with which the Europeans might not be happy. So this is what the Europeans are trying to do. We see that even as the Americans and the Russians, however tentatively, are trying to edge towards each other, in practice, the Europeans are trying to set this process back. Now, the Russians today have made further comments about this, and when I say the Russians, I mean Ushakov. And importantly, Ushakov has done this in conversations with Pavel Zarubin, who is, of course, the top media personality, top media journalist, who works very closely with Putin and who could be said almost to be a semi-detached member of the Kremlin, of Putin's own staff. Now, this apparently was an interview that Ushakov gave on Wednesday, so it's coordinated with all of the other statements that were made on that day. Putin's comments at the press conference, Ushakov's own meeting with Wyckoff, Lavrov's statement warning about the Europeans, which I've just read. And this is what Ushakov said to Zarubin. We view these calls from the West and Kiev for a ceasefire as an attempt to give the Ukrainian troops a respite as they are currently experiencing tough times. The Russian army is advancing in all directions. In this situation, it appears to be an effort to allow the Ukrainian military time to rearm and regroup. Russia's stance and concerns on this issue are well known to everyone. So, those questions that Putin asked about whether the Ukrainians will continue to receive weapons, whether mobilization in Ukraine will continue, who will enforce the ceasefire. These are substantive issues. The Russians want the mobilization to end. They want weapons deliveries to Ukraine to end. They want ceasefire monitors that they can trust. Ceasefire monitors, perhaps, on Ukraine's western border and maybe in Odessa and as well, to track any deliveries of weapons into Ukraine during this period of the ceasefire. And when the Russians bring up the question of enforcement, the Russians are saying that this is fundamental to make the ceasefire work, and it has to be something that the Americans and the Russians work out with each other without the Europeans involved, because enforcement cannot be done by the Europeans. The Europeans are on Ukraine's side, so they cannot be allowed to enforce the ceasefire. So that is one thing that Ushakov said. He also, by the way, confirmed that the Americans and the Russians are busy trying to get a summit meeting organized. We are preparing for the meeting, and it will be organized as soon as there is a need for it. And here again, we see that the Russians are not in any rush to agree a meeting with Trump. Firstly, they want all these key questions about the ceasefire to be ironed out. Now, I think the Americans will bend on much of this. I don't get the sense that the Americans are any more keen on European peacekeepers to be sent to Ukraine than the Russians are. Certainly, they don't want to give any security guarantees, and Trump himself clearly does want to improve relations with Russia, and he wants to get the conflict in Ukraine out of the way in order to do that. So I suspect that the Americans and the Russians will sit down and talk together, and they'll try to iron out the problems with a ceasefire. But if the Trump White House starts to move towards the Russian position on these questions, you can be absolutely sure that they will run into fierce opposition from Zelensky and from Starmer and Macron as well. So when Putin is very cautious, when he talks about how this process is not easy, if not to say very complicated, and when he wants to talk, as he did, not just to Lavrov, the foreign minister, but to his chief intelligence chief, Narishkin, about what the prospects of all of this are, well, you can understand his concerns. So there it is. This is a very complicated political game. The Americans do have the power over their allies to break through. The big question is how united the Trump administration, the Trump people, are in achieving this progress. Maybe because of the problems with Kellogg, the fact that he seemed to be not just too close to the Ukrainians, but too close to the Europeans as well. Maybe that is the reason why he has been parked into becoming Trump's representative to Kiev. So a complex game is going to be played over the next couple of weeks. Probably it will take at least some weeks. And it depends very much on Trump's own long-term commitment. In the meantime, the Russians will press on with a special military operation. Now, Glenn Deason and I were privileged on Friday to speak with Ambassador Polyansky, who represents Russia's mission, who is one of the people within Russia's mission to the United Nations. In fact, he's the deputy head of mission. And he again said the Russians are prepared now to look at the idea of a ceasefire because they've noted the major concessions that the Americans wrung out of the Ukrainians in Jeddah. The agreement to cease hostilities, something that the Ukrainians have resisted up to this point. The fact that the Ukrainians are no longer demanding, at least there was no comment in the Jeddah statement, about the return of all their territories and things like that. But Ambassador Polyansky also made it clear that the Russians retain the objective of achieving their objectives in the special military operation. And as I discussed in the first part of this program, the Russian offensive in Donbass continues all along the line. There is no sign that the Russians are altering any of their military plans in light of the discussions that are underway. And Well, as I've said many times, the longer that this is left before a cessation of hostilities is reached, the less of Ukraine will be left. Well, this is where I end my program today. There'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, please remember, if you like this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.